Hi, Erin. I just wanted to say that I appreciate your analysis on the Michelle Carter case and that I agree with a lot of your points. You highlighted how this case gained so much media attention because it was unprecedented, and there was no clear precedence for holding someone legally accountable for encouraging suicide through text. I just think that the media loves stories with a shocking twist, and both Michelle's behavior and the virtual relationship they had really just captured that dynamic that was shocking to a lot of people. It's an unsettling case, but I think it's good to challenge our beliefs about free speech and criminal liability, and the media coverage did a good job at reflecting that. You make a great point about Michelle's gender and how it might have affected the public's perception of her. Society often expects young women to be nurturing and empathetic, so when Michelle acted in such a manipulative way, it went against those expectations. So you're right that the media played a role in amplifying her gendered behavior, which casted her as emotionally driven and seeking validation, which fit into common stereotypes. As for her age, I agree that it likely softened the public's view to some extent, but it also didn't absolve her of her responsibility. The leniency in her sentence, though, seems to reflect the judge's recognition of her potential for rehabilitation, which is an interesting aspect of the case. When it comes to Michelle's bench trial, your perspective makes sense given the unique nature of the case. Having a judge, someone with legal expertise, was definitely a strategic choice, and you're right that the jury might have been swayed by emotions and media bias, so a bench trial could have led to a fair, less biased ruling. And on the judge's decision, I think you um, are right about the balance between accountability and leniency. The judge's recognition of Michelle's youth and potential for rehabilitation was important, but it also raised questions about how we balance personal autonomy and moral responsibility. It's a tricky situation, and the question of where to draw the line on free speech in cases like this is definitely not an easy answer. But your discussion on gender lenses in understanding homicide is spot on. Gender roles really shape how men and women approach violence, especially in the context of masculinity and male dominance. You mentioned how men are more likely to resort to violence because it aligns with societal expectations on dominance, and I think that's a critical viewpoint because the patriarchal system often promotes aggression as a way for men to assert control, and understanding this can really help us understand why men are more likely to commit homicides. Um, when it comes to why women are less likely to commit homicides against other women, you make an important point about the context, meaning women's violence is usually more situational and tied to self-defense in abusive relationships. Um, this shows the difference in motivations between men and women, and men are often driven by societal expectations, while women's actions are often a response to their circumstances. You're absolutely right that suicide is more common than homicide in the US, and I agree with your point that suicide receives less media attention. The stigma surrounding mental health is a huge factor in why suicide doesn't go um, on the news as much, even though it's far more like a bigger issue. I also appreciate your thoughts on the gender differences in suicide attempts and completions. Men's reluctance to seek help due to societal expectations around masculinity is a big contributor to the high fatality rate among men, a woman's tendency to reach out for support likely leads to a lower completion rate. And then your analysis on Deer's work on gender equity in traditional law is fascinating. I think the contrast between pre-colonial Native justice systems and the patriarchal systems that followed is an important aspect of this discussion. Um, the way Native societies had a victim-centered approach to rape allowed women to dictate the punishment for their assailants. It's so progressive compared to today's legal systems, and it's really just a shame that colonial influence eroded these traditions, and I think that we should revisit them and learn from them. And finally, your explanation on the legal loophole preventing prosecution on reservations really sheds light on the issue. The inability to prosecute non-native offenders on tribal land have left Native women particularly vulnerable to violence. As you mentioned, Native women face a disproportionately high risk of being assaulted, and the lack of legal resources for crimes committed by non-Native individuals on reservations only compounds this problem. So I just want to end by saying thank you again for your analysis. It was really great to hear your perspective. I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think you really captured these topics.